Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, for coming here. And it's always such a, warm feeling to, see different folks coming in and, being just taking out time of their schedules, because Saturday evening is always meant for some kind of party. Let's take it as a party as well, because I'm not going to bore you with really jargonized stuff. So I'm just going to tell you stories. I mean, evening times are for stories, right? At the outset, thanks to BIC, thanks to the team of BIC for giving us this platform, for the space to briefly talk about my, recently published work. And obviously the kind of conversation or the perspectives that I'm going to share will not just be restricted to my book, that is Performing Memories and Weaving Archives, but also would expand in connection to that work, would expand beyond that as well. I would like to start with this very basic perspective. Why did I at all venture into this space, into this particular work? And I always do that very deliberately, because as a researcher, as a thinker, as a writer, I always feel that it is very crucial for me to clarify my set of positionalities from where I speak, so that I shouldn't appear as someone who is trying to be appropriative and assimilative in nature, trying to steal other spaces or trying to imagine others' experiences as my own and trying to speak on their behalf. So it's very important to clarify that. So I'm from the city of Kolkata. I am, by ethnicity, I identify myself as a Bengali. My ancestors in fact, my grandparents from both the sides were from different parts of Bangladesh. And my childhood has always been filled with very hilarious as well as stories that are full of tensions and pains and agonies about crossing the borders. So, now, crossing the borders, more or less, we are all familiar with the basic partition narratives, if I tell in that. We all know that crossing the border process was not just a physical crossing. It was an ideological crossing. It was a cultural crossing. It was about being selective of what to bring along and what to be left behind, and then leaving with these memories of leaving behind, along with the memories of what is right there. So it is always altogether a very complex and layered space. And it is this complex and layered stories, basically, that serve as one of the many foundational perspectives for me to build up this project. And that is from where my understanding of creolization of cultures and traditions have always taken place. Obviously, with due reference, with due acknowledgement of the different thinkers like Ananya Jahanara Kabir. Then you have people like Lewis Gordon from the Caribbean islands working in the US, and many other Creole scholars and thinkers who have always felt, or who always argue through the work, that how important it is to understand our respective cultures, traditions, and perspectives through a very fluid, flexible, and porous lens. And I felt that this work could be, very important, very relevant in the contemporary times, especially where we are always running after this whole narrative of authenticity, fighting for what is my authentic food, what is my authentic fashion, what is my authentic religion, what is my authentic dress. This whole crazy run behind authenticity, if we look from a creolized lens, we would understand that it is quite problematic in many ways. And obviously, again, to clarify that I don't dismiss the existence of authenticity, but what I am really critical about is this blind affinity, this blind fetishism, without really trying to understand the underlying layers and the mixtures and the amalgamations and the overlaps. We try to appropriate a space just through our imaginations and perspectives of authentic by dismissing the existence of certain cultures and traditions, is what I found authenticity as problematic, just to clarify it very right there. Now, But then the obvious question arises, like in this particular work, why did I really venture into the space of Afro-Indian Creole cultures? Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of it. This very interesting community who are widely known as the Siddis, which is quite a big number in Karnataka as well. Along with Karnataka, we have a huge Siddi population in Hyderabad. We have a very massive Siddi population in Gujarat as well. And my work specifically focused on a selective part of the community in Gujarat. And now, Siddis, the interesting part, and my venturing into the Siddi space is also quite interesting because by training, I am a hand percussionist and I love to play different types of drums. I mean, I got trained in tabla, then I eventually did different types of hand drums. And obviously, amongst various hand drums, African hand drums like djembe, tarbuka, and various other sorts of local traditional African hand drums fascinates me a lot. And that is one aspect of venturing into the space of Afro-Indian Creole cultures and traditions was music. And the other part was obviously food. Food is another thing that not only appeals to my palate, but also widely speaks to my work as well. Where always I find this, in terms of usage of spices, usage of cooking methods, presenting, how we sort of have, adopted lot of food cultures or cooking cultures or taste cultures from different countries across the world, and how that is related, how that is not just like a spontaneous act, but they're sort of very much deeply rooted and related to the whole history of spice trade, right? Like if you look at the spice trade at the time of, the Dutch, colonization, if you look at the spice trade of British colonization, if we look at the spice trade at the time of Danish colonization, we get ample of these instances where, we see these spice routes or spice maps, like how from Southeast Asia, just give an example, like how from Southeast Asia, spices have traveled to Bengal, to Kerala, to other parts of India. And from there, then it got traveled to different parts of Africa. From Africa, then it traveled to the Caribbean islands. Then from Caribbean islands, it's traveled to the US. Like, I mean, we can just have a very interesting spice map right in front of us, like looking at the world through spices, or looking at the world, through music or musical instruments or musical dimensions. And when we, take these counter lenses into account to look around our societies, around our cultures, it opens a very interesting set of avenues in front of us where often we see that we cannot imagine the borders exactly as they're presented in front of us when we look at a world map. Like the world map we are sort of introduced in schools, right in our childhood days. Specific border lines, this is this particular country, this is where the city is located, this is where the village is located, this is where the mountains are located. But when we take these alternative lenses, or let's say when we sort of try to imagine the atlas as a counter atlas, right? Let us see, the world through spice routes. Let us see the world through musical instruments. Let us see the world, through different sorts of spiritual traditions. Let us see the world through the monsoon, the rain, the river, the water. The whole perspective of the world becomes so fluid and porous. I mean, we can have the same world, the same structure from diverse lenses. And that is, again, what widely feeds into this concept of creolization that I'm trying to talk about in my work. I mean, usually what happens when we use the word Creole, it's used in terms of the linguistic perspectives, widely language perspective, which is obviously there. But beyond that, we can imagine Creole as this particular space itself is Creole, like where you're not just, told that, okay, you're from Maharashtra, so you just guys sit with a bunch of Maharashtrians. You are from Kerala, you sit with a bunch of guys who are from Kerala. You can just walk in, walk out, sit here wherever you want to sit, whatever you want to hear, whatever you want to feed in, whatever you want to feed out. I mean, this is itself a creolized space where it is very porous, which is very fluid. People coming from different walks of life, from different positions of their existence, with different patterns and perspectives of their interest, but still we sit here and we listen to each other. So creolization as a way of life. Now, what happens if we take this as one of the many ways of reimagining our existence around us, is what was the overarching question that I try to feed into my work. And these questions I try to understand by, working with, learning with various Afro-Indian community groups in Gujarat. What I was talking to you about, the Siddis. And when I was engaging with this, it is so fascinating to see like how over the past 500 years, they have brought up this very interesting ancestral traditions from Ethiopia, widely what was earlier known as the Nubian Valley. Now you can see in terms of Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, and all of these places, from Kenya and Tanzania, widely from eastern parts of Europe to Gujarat, and how those cultural memories that they already inherited from their ancestors got eventually intermingled with the local memories and cultures. Let me give you a very interesting example. This is this, so the Siddis in the Siddi community, the Afro-Indian community in Gujarat, because as the history says, they were brought in by the Islamic invaders around 13th century. At that point of time, they were forced to get converted into Islam. So you find mostly they follow a Sufi sect of Islam, which is again very common in Sudan and all of these places as well, if you ever visit those places and if you see the practices. Now, the interesting part is they sing a kind of religious song, they are referred to as Zikrs. Religious songs that they remember their ancestors. Now, the interesting part of the Zikrs is obviously they're like sung in Hindi, a mixture of Arabic, Urdu, Hindi. But then a lot of these songs are sort of, carrying words which are Swahili words. But again, they are not the standard Swahili words that are spoken currently in different parts of Eastern Africa, like Kenya, Tanzania, or other parts of Africa. So they are like the Swahili Creole words, those words that got sort of mixed up, with the local lingua, local languages, local perspectives. Now, this is something which is absolutely fascinating. Now, you don't see the stories really. A lot of work has already been done about the Siddis. It's not the first time I'm doing something, right? There's a whole lot of literature that's put out Siddis out in the online search. You will find a whole lot of literature there. But then what you see is it's mostly about moving from that superficial, or let me say as a very elitist lens of theory, then moving into the community rather than going the other way around. That is walking through the community into seeing where do we place the Siddis or how do we understand the Siddis. So when I was working, when I was learning about their music, looking at the performances, the way they are singing the songs has a lot of very, very interesting affinity with the Eastern African cultural traditions. For instance, the way they dance. Okay, so there are two types of dances. They are known as Dhamaals. I'm just giving you examples to feed in what exactly I was trying to talk about creolizations. And also, let me just check the time once. So, So maybe I'll just wrap up in another, 5 minutes. So what I was trying to tell is, for instance, their dance. So their dance are widely known as Dhamaals. So they have two types of Dhamaals. One is called the Baithaki Dhamaal, that is they sit and perform, where they don't dance. They just play the musical instruments. And another is the dance Dhamaal that they do. Now, if you look at the whole performative element. So for instance, in dance Dhamaal, I'm just giving you a verbal, kind of description. If you are very interested to look at some of the documentaries that I've done, please feel free to go to, this YouTube channel called Roots and Roots, like ROOTS and ROUTES. Roots and Roots, a living archive. There you will see a lot of these performances out there. Now, when you look at these performances, they start any kind of dance Dhamaal, first of all, by playing the conch shell. Now, this playing the conch shell is a culture which is not just Indian, but also in lot of cultures across the world, including a lot of African cultures as well, where you start a performance by playing the conch shell. Then what happens is they play a lot of these drums which are very much rooted to local Eastern African musical cultures, like Musindo. They have a drum like Musindo, which is again looks like a dholak. Okay, it looks like a dholak. It is a wider platform on the side, but it looks like a dholak. Then they have this, one string instrument called malunga. Now, this malunga is again a very locally Eastern African instrument. It's just like ektara, like very similar to ektara, but it is this one string. They still play the malunga. Then, they have this musical instrument called the misirkanga. It's like a jingle, but then it is again very Eastern African. Interestingly, the jingling sound comes with the stones that are there in that funnel-shaped instrument. They play it by jingling, and those 108 stones are always collected from the oceans. So that is where my research, my work, also my stories also connect this question of ocean. How these movements across the Indian Ocean from Eastern Africa towards Gujarat and other parts of India not only sort of influence their intermixed cultural practices, where they have brought some of these Eastern African cultural values and intermingled with the local ones, but then how these water bodies, the nature, the forest has played an important role in shaping up their cultures. So when you listen to some of the Zikrs, they talk about how their spiritual ancestors like Baba Gaur, Mai Mishra, all of their Eastern African spiritual ancestors, Baba Habash and all of them, how they have traveled across from the ocean and the desert, and how much efforts they have taken, to come and cross the rivers and the mountains and the forests to come there and, to bless them. So, it is a wonderful, when you look at the narratives, what is really, first of all, interesting is just to, not being able to trap or understand their histories and cultures within specific binaries. That's the number one thing. That is, you really can't put them within fixed binaries. Number two thing is what you see is the whole complex entanglement of their cultural practices. I mean, in India, we so much talk about, the diversity of cultures and traditions. We so much talk about that, at least we talk about. The representation is a different set of questions, a different set of controversy. We're not getting into that. But we at least tell to people, like it's a diverse country with diverse cultures and traditions. But when you venture into these spaces and when we try to learn from these communities and how they are being represented in terms of music and dance, we actually find, sadly, a lot of these stories have not been shared so far. They need to be shared. They need to be talked about. Obviously, I don't consider myself as somebody very capable or somebody, like a self-certified storyteller. But it was, for me, this work was just a humble acknowledgement of the learnings that I have learned from them. It is just a humble acknowledgement. I learned about certain cultures and traditions which are not so much spoken about, but which needs to be talked about, thought about, at least visited and understood. And also I felt that through this particular acknowledgement, I can at least humbly invite all of us to consistently rethink our cultural maps, our cultural existence, our social existence in more entangled ways, in more, relatable ways, and through these values of co-caring and co-sharing, where we don't try to create barriers, where we don't try to immediately live with preconceived hierarchies, but at least we can be a part of those exchanges and try to understand each other as deeply, as warmly, and as lovingly as possible in a time when all of these values are getting so badly and toxically getting compromised. So obviously there are endless stories to tell, but I want to just stop here. Thank you so much.
Shayan, may we have Dr. Payal and Professor Elizabeth join Shayan and continue this discussion.
We thought that we will discuss a little bit and then we will throw the floor open for questions so that there's a good amount of discussions. I think that would work for everyone. If given a chance, I think, Shayan, I would just not have this discussion and endlessly go on listening to you. It was as captivating as your book. When I was reading Shayan's book, I was just sharing with him and I wanted to put it on records today in front of everyone and in front of the camera specifically, that I'm always so hooked to reading thrillers. And Shayan's book was nothing short of a thriller for me. It was, of course, it's not a genre, but what I meant to say is that it makes such a captivating reading, and I had to finish the entire book at one go. What had struck me, Sayan, and I told you that I'm going to tell this to you in BIC and not on the phone, is that Sayan was just sharing with all of us that Sayan has a lot of connections to different parts of Bangladesh, the then East Bengal at one point of time through his parents on both the sides. And I do not know, Sayan, if you're aware of it or not. Even I also happen to have a similar kind of connections. I have lived my entire life before coming to Bangalore in the northeastern part of India, and the connection was, of course, through my parents, who had, of course, not lived there, but their parents had. And when I was reading Sayan's book, I thought about one thing, that cultures all over the world are very different, geographically so spaced out, but then how they're connected, is amazing. When Sayan was telling all of us about the most important dance performance of the Siddis, which Sayan has beautifully written in his book, Dhamaal. Sayan, do you know that there is this very popular dance form of people from Bangladesh, which is practiced so much in Northeast, by the Bengalis, known as Dhamaal? Known as Dhamaal and Dhamail and the same thing. And there are a lot of things that Sayan has written in his book about that performance, which are things which are done before the performance, things which are done during the performance, of how the community of men and women come together and they perform, which are things that I have grown up doing and seeing. So how cultures over the world, even though we are spaced out so much, are in some way connected. Probably that is something that we have to figure out. Now, I was wondering, Sayan, if you could tell us a little more about, we know how and why you embarked on this journey, but I'm very curious to know, as a cultural studies enthusiast, how did you manage to actually get into the community? Because you cannot write a book just by sitting comfortably in your armchair, in your desk, and the book comes out. When we read the book, we know that Sayan has lived that life. Sayan has actually been there. So I'm very curious to know, Sayan, that how did you connect with those people, with the community in Gujarat? How did you, become a part of their life? How did you get invited to their very personal space? And how did you manage to do that? All the more difficult for me when you were back in South Africa. And did you face any challenges? Were there things that you have carried back? Were there any transitions in you as a scholar that you felt? How was that connect that you achieved for this particular book?
Yeah, thank you so much, Payal, for this question. And it is actually such a terrific question to start with, because these were some of the questions that I asked myself. And engaging in any kind of community research, I always feel, whether I'm working with my own community to which I belong or working with other communities which I don't belong to physically or historically or culturally, this self-questioning process is very important. Like, who exactly am I to work just in a community? I mean, just being an academician or, sitting in a very privileged space never really ethically or culturally, morally ever gives me this sort of right just to think and work about a particular community. So the first and the foremost thing was, this self-schooling was very important for me. And that's a That's a very hard process, I must confess. And this confession is very important because, the self-schooling process, the endless number of why and how and what I was triggered with. Even before thinking about working with this, working with, the Siddis. And also there is an other side of the book as well, that is with the South African Indian communities who trace their ancestry from the Indian indentured laborers. That is also a very strong other side of the book as well. So it's almost like a comparative study. The first thing I wanted to make sure is that I don't walk into the community, I walk with the community. That is the first and the foremost thing I wanted to share. Wanted to make sure that it shouldn't be this into, because into is a very invasive process. Into is a very, self-styled, self-celebratory process, self-certified process that I can just walk into because I have this XYZ privileges. And a lot of these research works, under these categories of CSR and a lot of other perspectives do work in the same pattern still, that just because we have money, we can just walk into a space and think ourselves as social actors and do whatever we want to do for the sake of our business. So the first thing is like walk with. Now, again, walking with is also not an easy task. Why they would allow me to walk with them? Even I'm not a Siddi, I'm not a South African Indian, so how do I start with that process? So the process was obviously, getting in touch with researchers, thinkers who are from within those communities and who have obviously facilitated these kind of researches first. And then obviously being very humble, nice and respectful with this whole aspect that they for sure will be skeptical about me, and I have to bear that process. They will be skeptical why exactly I want to work with them. Why should I write about them? They can write, they have other resources to write about them, to talk about them. Why exactly I should go and work with them? So, these barriers and hurdles were extremely tough, where my positionality, my perspective was getting consistently questioned. And that process was important. I'm appreciating that process. But it is a very unsettling process as well. It's very emotionally unsettling process, right? Where you have to keep on questioning yourself, but it is a very humble process as well. And that is very important. So that was one of the many beginning points. And that is also the moment we start walking with them. So for instance, what I did is in the book, I wanted to make sure that though I am the official author of this book, you see my name, it is very important. I acknowledge it everywhere, and I like to acknowledge here as well that this work wouldn't have existed without the contributions of these community members. They are also the authors of this book. They are also the authors of this book. Not just I have just for the sake of a formality and well-being, I have put their name in the acknowledgement section, but I acknowledge them in each and every chapter with their due respect, with their due permission. Even before sending this manuscript to those doing all of those following official guidelines of the publishers, this manuscript was sent to the community. Obviously, everybody, the language was a barrier. Very sadly, very unfortunately, I don't understand Gujarati. Very sadly and unfortunately, I wrote this book, and I see this, with a lot of embarrassment, but this is, I need to be honest to confess all of these elements in the public space as well, that I did write this book in English because I felt that is the only language, sadly, I know to connect with the maximum possible people across the country and the world. But despite those limitations, I could manage to make a lot of them read my work and to understand their perspective, to receive their critique, even before my work is being judged by the usual formal process, reviewers, peer reviews, and all of these heavy, hefty processes. For me, that review was most important for me, even before it goes into what the community people think about my work. Am I trying to unconsciously or consciously appropriate their work? It shouldn't appear that I take away or I steal away their ideas and perspectives and then go around, do my own set of interpretations, and then it comes out something else. In the past, it has happened. with the Siddi community in the past has happened, and with other communities also. I'm very sure here those who are specifically sitting here and who do work closely with communities in whatever capacities. I'm not just talking from academic and research perspective. We know that appropriation is a major process. And believe me, I was very, very afraid of myself for that reason. I shouldn't end up doing the thing that I'm trying to critique through my work. So that was a very tensed process, very unsettling process, very worrisome process, no problem for me to confess, but also at the same time a very humbling process. So this is, and most importantly, another way that I acknowledge, what I was talking about, the porosity and the fluidity of our existence, is I never conclude my work. There is no conclusion in my work. It always have to be deliberately in continuity. It has to be a continuity. Because, there is no way I can conclude my work. There is no possibility of my conclusion of my work. And I was also, when I was speaking, I was sharing about, these elements of, how and what are some of the possible ways where we can establish this culture of co-caring and co-sharing, where we don't have to sit and agree with each other. We can be critical about each other's perspectives. We can disagree with each other, but we don't have to cancel out each other. And what really intrigues me, makes me very painful in the current global scenario, I would say, not just in the Indian scenario, in the global scenario, where this cancel culture is becoming more and more normalized and celebrative in nature. Just because I don't like something, I don't have the authority to cancel out somebody. I can just sit here, disagree, be critical, continue with the conversation and still keep on disagreeing, but I don't have to compromise with respectability. I don't have to compromise with my values of humbleness. And that is what is getting compromised in everyday life. From right through these conversations to the social media, we have ample of examples to say. So this work is also an invitation to, on a wider range, through a particular lens of creolization, we can say, but in a wider range is an invitation to think, how can we continue this space with each other? Maybe not all together, maybe in small pockets, maybe in small groups, but the possibility of continuity has to be there. So these are obviously some of the perspectives that more or less enabled me to do this work. And again, I have no problem in saying that it's a very incomplete work. And obviously, I could have done much of a better work. And, it was a learning process, and it will remain a learning process for me forever. That is the way I acknowledge this space, acknowledge this work, acknowledge this project. And most importantly, the community is what is they taught to me, all of these values.
I think that's just an amazing way of, for any researcher for that matter, who's working on cultural studies to be so inclusive. It's not just about writing a book and then taking the materials and then, it's only for that purpose. So that's a great learning, Sayan. I was also wondering, Sayan, that when we read your book, Elizabeth also, you must have noticed that Sayan has actually focused on three cultural entities, creolized entities particularly, the spirituals, the music and the dance, and the culinary, elements of the community. Were there anything, I understand that these three elements are probably the most important, cultural elements, but were you very particular about your selection of these three cultural entities? What were your reasons behind it? And if today, for example, you are writing the book all over again, do you think that there is one more element probably which you would have considered and that would have actually, made your book not better, but a lot more inclusive? Is there something else that you could think of? That is something which I was thinking, that cultural elements are many. Of course, these three are the most important ones. But why did you select those three?
Well, yes, this is another very tricky question because first of all, again, to just share, obviously, there are many cultural elements that I couldn't talk about. It's not I didn't talk, but I couldn't talk about. And as I say, that is why I always conceive my work as a continuity. Primarily for choosing these three are first my positional affinity towards these values, right? When I was sharing like food, music and spiritual practices, diverse forms of spiritual practices play a very important role in my cultural understanding. And as I was saying, like for food is not that, I mean, obviously we all love eating different types of things, but for me it was not just about the pleasure of my palates, but also it is about a lot of cultural values, a lot of, ancestral rootedness, but also then openness to other cultures and traditions. So food was for me one of those language in which I try to understand.
Yeah,
yes.
If I may interrupt, Elizabeth, I mean, when he's talking about it, and we should not forget that I think these two things, one is the music and the dance and the culinary things. Sayan is so immersed in that, right? He's a great cook, as far as I also know. He loves to, dabble with that art. So that might also be one of the reasons.
No, absolutely. I mean, I do work very seriously on culinary cultures as well. Like culinary cultures is not just what I, do like sort of a performance in the kitchen, or I love to, cook and eat and obviously invite people to eat. And, but also at the same time, I try to understand my cultures and my traditions around me and the different communities and their existence through the lens of food as well, like through the lens of taste, through the lens of spices, through the lens of different kinds of ingredients that I'm using in a particular food. And for me, every element of this bear a culture. The same for music as well. As I shared that, like I'm a trained percussionist. So, these sort of, when I play the music, it is obviously for aesthetic pleasure. But along with that, it also adds a lot of value that what I'm trying to speak through the music, I'm trying to say something. Okay, even if I'm just playing it in an enclosed room to myself, I'm saying something to myself. What exactly I'm saying? Now, that is a deep cultural question for me. When I'm watching a spiritual performance, it can be from a religious perspective, it can be from a not a really very religious perspective, any other forms of spiritual perspective. When I'm watching a spiritual performance, how do I feel connected to a spiritual performance? For me, it's a cultural question. It's a very deep cultural question. And these are some of the questions that fed into my work. But again, just to acknowledge, I mean, if you ask me to rethink about this work, expand this work, I would love to bring in architecture. I mean, architecture, Creole architecture is a very major space, even just with these two communities, is a very major space to engage with. I mean, we can talk about Creole fashion, like Creole dresses is a very, very, like for instance, let me tell you, in the context of the Siddi community widely in Karnataka, they're very good weavers. If you go around and visit this various Siddi locations in Karnataka, they're very good weavers. One of their major style/form of weaving is patchwork weaving. Right? A lot of these which you see in the design of the harem pants, these patchworks. Now, patchwork weaving is what they have vastly inherited from their African ancestors. In Africa also, patchwork weaving, like patchwork quilts is a major work. And interestingly, what stories they tell through patchworks? They tell the stories of the oceans. They tell the stories of their ancestors. They tell the stories of fishes. They tell the stories of cowrie shells. They tell the stories of their boats, of the forests. And that is one of the many very strong ways of preserving their ancestral memories, ancestral traditions, ancestral values. So, patchwork quilts, fantastic place to work with. So, there are many, many other endless perspectives that we can work with. But these are the primary things that personally appeal to me from my respective positionalities, from my respective ways of learning, that sort of triggered me to at least initiate the conversation with these three elements. And then obviously we can multiply it all together as we go ahead.
That's, your personal engagements actually, that's, I think, the one thing that hooks the reader. So let me also reiterate what Payal has already said, that I really enjoyed reading the book, and it was wonderfully written, and it was a breezy read. And I think that's a real compliment to an academic in the time where, academic books are considered inaccessible because they are jargon heavy or theory heavy and so on. And I thought that you were able to do justice to bring out these deep and rich histories while being minimalist about it, without adding reams and reams of pages. Although, as you yourself said, there can be several other stories that can endlessly tell about them. And what that led me to think about was these 2-3 central ideas. Let's say we can place your book squarely in diasporic studies, also transoceanic studies, because my own interest is in partly cultural studies through political theory and thinking about social histories and so on. Let me begin with a little bit of a heavier question, which you were also alluding to. This notion of diversity and representation as being almost like antithetical to each other in some ways. So probably in our times, it's banal to say that identities are plural. It's not just that they are not homogeneous, that they are not linear, and they are not unchanging. And that's not just true for these creolized communities, but everybody in this room, right? So everybody has a plural, and they can identify their own identities only as networks, as changing how they define themselves at 20 and how they define themselves at 50 would not be the same. However, the deepest irony of our contemporary times is that the state can process people only through homogeneous identities. So if we take the two paradigms in which the state looks at people, one is, let's say, the nationalistic imagination, where the idea of a nation or idea of a people largely feeds into or largely is parasitic on one dominant notion of who are these people and how should we define them. Where multiple identities somehow either cannot percolate in or are not allowed to, let's say. The other is, I think, the welfare state model, which we are not so critical of probably as much as the national imagination. But the welfare state imagination also has to sort of bring the communities down to one kind of identities. So I think one of the most important questions is not how identities can be defined or whether they are plural or not, but rather how they play out, right? So while I was reading your book, I was thinking about this several times. How would even a sympathetic and maybe a deeply reflective state deal with communities like the Siddis in Gujarat? In fact, one of the ways in which, even we, if we are not reading something like Sayan's book or many other books, we would think of Siddis as one of those alternate religious groups, who do some jadoo tona type of thing. That's the caricatured version of them that we know through some popular media. So this rich histories that we get through your work would simply be elided, simply never come to us. So how, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how these communities, both the South African Indians and say the African Indians in various parts of India, how would they think of this notion of belonging, a homeland, and so on? Did that question ever come up in your interactions with them? And how would the state process a set of groups who wouldn't want to call themselves obviously this or that they are obviously Muslim or obviously Sufi or Hindu, or that they are either slaves or elite or something else? And the fact that they might not want to call themselves only South Africans or only Indians. Will we ever move to a time where the state can work with these, what we really know in fact to be porous identity situations? So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Absolutely, and I think this is such an important question, especially where do we stand in various social, cultural, political, and other perspectives in the contemporary times. and not just in India, but also again, it's a sort of a global perspective. And I would like to start, responding to this question with one a narrative that was shared by some of the Siddi the Siddi people there about their ancestral values and how do they perform them in the contemporary times. They're often made to perform Africanness in the public, and that is a very racialized practice. Now, what do I mean by that? Like, for instance, when Donald Trump visited Gujarat, so he paraded across the city, and we know the socio-political dynamics, why he was paraded in that way. And then the Siddi, one of the Siddi dance groups were invited, to show performance. How are you all Africans? How do you look like Africans being in India? And you won't believe that was sponsored by a very reputed cultural body, and I'm not going to tell the name obviously here. A very reputed cultural body, Indian cultural body. We know, all of us here, we know the name. And they sponsored the dance process, and I met that particular group of performers, and they said, when I asked them that the way you dressed with, bird feathers and white, spots on your face and braided hairs, semi-bared bodies, and we were playing the drums and dances. Is this what you have inherited as a practice from your ancestors? And they said, we had no idea about it. We were made to do that. We were asked to perform that Africanness. You will get some money, you will get some sponsorships. Maybe in the future, you get chance to go abroad and perform in cultural festivals. But what do you do with that? You compromise with your identity. They say that we are actually on a lot of occasions, sort of forced to perform that Africanness just to make our existence be prominent. But you see the other side of the reality. That is where you tell to the world, you see, India is so diverse. We also have Africans in India who stay and they are so happy. But you see the other side of the reality. Till date, Siddis who are by default the citizens of India, they have all the basic, documentations that are required to prove ourselves as citizens, are still being habitually harassed in banks when they show their documents and tell them we want to open a bank account. They're harassed and told, oh, you don't look like an Indian. You have an African hair. You have an African feature. Your skin color look black. No, your documentation is wrong. You're presenting a fake documentation. They know very well that they are the citizens of India. And then they have to go to the police station, and there is another level of harassments and bribery, and before they're able to do their work. And this is a systemic way of doing it. Let me again take you to the simultaneous story. That is how glorification and marginalization goes hand in hand. In 1989 and the 1990s, India actually, that was the first time the community has been existing for 500 years plus in India, with such a huge number of groups across Gujarat and Hyderabad and Karnataka, as I all shared with you. It was in 89, 90s when the country came to know, oh, we have people of African origin in India. How? Through a special area games project. Now, what was the narrative? If you even read the language out there, it's so annoying. It's so racialized in nature. They are Africans. Africans have good energy. They have physical prowess. They can win a few medals for us, in the Olympic Games. Indians can't do that, so probably, we can make the Africans run. After 4 or 5 years, it was an election gimmick. After 4 or 5 years, the project was shut. Media stopped coverage. When you talk to these people, and most of them, they were actually taken from Karnataka Siddis. Right? When you talk to these Siddi folks, they were out of the story. In the midway where they're thrown, they didn't know what to do going back to the village. They were basically, at least they were connected to agriculture at one point of time. They were going to the schools. But then, They were promised a life which was never to be achieved. In the midway, they were just dumped out. And no one knows about them. Now they're running some errand shops, some agriculture. Couple of them could manage to play for Karnataka in the national games. They are now bringing up the transformation through sports project and trying to mobilize the Siddi people through sports and all. They are taking the initiatives, but still, funding questions, acknowledgement questions, which are very connected deeply to this whole politics of nation state, and then obviously underfed with these narratives of casteism, racism, and all of these different perspectives. So the question is coming, and why I wanted to, take you through this simultaneous narratives where on the one side you see this blatant glorification as a sort of masking the reality, and the other side, the reality is an absolute marginalization, absolute demonization of a particular group of people. And it is still happening. Just one small example, if you look at the logo of IIM Ahmedabad, right? It is at the Siddi Side Mosque. It is a Siddi Side Mosque. If you see that webbed design, Siddi Side Mosque, how many of us really know about the Siddi Side Mosque? Why it is Siddi Side? It was built by Siddi Side, one of the famous Siddi architects amongst the Siddi community. How many of us read about Siddi Side in those history books and all? Do we hardly read about the Siddis ever? A lot of their musical narratives, lot of the musical cultures, playing of hand drums, the kind of beats and movements which has been absolutely, stereotyped and, sort of distorted in these reputed Bollywood movies. There is a whole repertoire of how Bollywood has appropriated and racialized African bodies in their films. And many Siddis also played roles there. Have they been acknowledged as actors there? No. So, the way they have been treated, and they are being treated in this country so far, in terms of their culture, so only it is about those portions, those dimensions of their existence that are enough saleable, that are enough marketable, that are enough for politicization and propagandization are being put out there. Rest of are being just cut and eroded and removed and silenced and dumped. That is how it works.
This actually also reminds me of this Richard Eaton's work on the Sufis of Bijapur. So, even though Sufis might not be marginalized like the Siddhis are, if we ask someone, okay, how would you define Sufis? You think of them as well-meaning religious mystics. But Eaton's work and probably many other work shows that Sufis had such varied social roles to play. They were sometimes reformers, they were sometimes military administrators who were very close to the courts. Sometimes they were artists and writers, sometimes they were reformers, sometimes they were also mystics and many other things like that. So, that, and you have very elaborately shown also how the Siddhi tradition creatively reappropriates many of the Sufi traditions in India. I was wondering, if we can use that also to ask another larger sort of question about this region, that is there something, let's say we contrast the diasporic narratives which are coming from Asia and Africa, and the same communities of Indian diaspora, which is in, let's say, either the West, the global North, let's say Europe or United States or Canada and so on. While they might be different, of course, their experiences are different, but is there something very, the other cultural possibilities in this oceanic region which makes for this very uniquely creolized or creative processes to emerge, right? Would the same kind of diversity of narratives be possible, let's say, with diasporic communities who are in the West? I mean, no doubt that they are also appropriating and their identities are also very mixed and plural. But as the author of Asia as Method and many others try to point out, even Eaton's work, and Eaton in fact has edited this very other fascinating book called Slavery in South Asia, which says that the slave narratives of South Asia are actually very different probably from slavery in other parts of the world, because the slaves here were not merely always oppressed or marginalized. They were also traversing many layers of this social history. So I was wondering if your work could be a stepping stone for us to think about what is the cultures of South Asia, and then from moving from Asia to the African histories and past, to see this region and its histories have made for much more of these creolization diversities possible as compared to other parts of the world. Of course, that's not a question that one can just answer right now in 2 minutes and say, yes, sure, there is this, that, and the other. But I really think that there's a terrain of possibilities to explore. And that is not to negate the agency which you want to give to this community. Surely they are making something, and it is not that the culture is available and automatically things happen to them. No. But how does agency and ethos and cultural patterns and environment interact in this region to be able to make possible this kind of rich narrative that you have told about the African Indians or the South African Indians? I think that would be something for us to consider and think about. If you, was there at some point that you thought, oh my God, I am indeed dealing with a very uniquely rich history, the possibilities of which have not been fully explored.
No, absolutely. In fact, just to start again with a very interesting example, so when I was just sharing my perspectives, I was also sharing this aspect of how this whole Sufi practice that we see amongst the Afro-Indians in India, the Siddi community in India, has, I again shouldn't say India, in Gujarat, because the Siddis in Karnataka are mostly Christians and, a few Hindus. The Siddis in Hyderabad are again Muslims, but they again derive and understand their religious and spiritual perspective quite different from the Siddis in Gujarat. So let's say the Zikr tradition or the Sufi tradition of the Siddis in Gujarat has to do a lot with the Dhikr tradition of Sudan. Like it's Dhikr, Dhikr, which is again, the same sort of ancestral values where you have these Sufi Muslims in Sudan. They have their ancestors, they play songs in the memory of their ancestors, and they have very identical, ritualistic performances of that dancing Dhamaal. They don't obviously tell Dhamaal, but the dancing performance, the sitting performance, the different kinds of musical instruments that they use for the sake of performance is also, has a lot, similar with what the Siddis play. So, these kind of tracings very interestingly, and it is also very encouraging for us to know that they were actually traced by the Siddis themselves. Thankfully, no one from outside tell, you have these similarities, now try to draw the line. So that is very, encouraging. That is very affirmative in the sense that, these people are also gradually getting into that space of understanding why, on the one hand, they should not only remember, when I use the remember word with an hyphen, their ancestral values and traditions in the contemporary creolized context, but at the same time, they also need to generate these planetary solidarities. Like, what about other forms of connections? For instance, a very interesting thing. If you go and talk to the Siddis in Gujarat, they have very interesting surnames. And why I'm telling interesting, I'll just tell you the reason as well. Like Murima, Makwa, right? Now, Murima and Makwa are not just random surnames they have. In the Tanzania-Kenya border, you find village with the names of Murima and Makwa. That is from their ancestors have come. So, what are we doing? We are trying to, draw these dots, these missing links. And once we start drawing these dots and missing links through the ocean, through the cultures, through the lifestyles, through the traditions, we are gradually venturing into this space of generating a global solidarity. In 2016, there is this organization called um, African diasporas across the world. African diasporas across the world, and they organize this a kind of gathering. They called it a conference, a fancy name, but it was warmly, if we can put it as a gathering, Goa in 2016. And the whole purpose was this: to see the missing links, to try to invite as many African diaspora community members, activists, thinkers, practitioners from across the world. And there was a gathering of like 120, 30 people from across the world there. So, these kind of perspectives, these kind of initiatives, do add a lot to this kind of imagining the world and trying to build up connections, not just within one's own communities, but across borders as well. But also, the thing is, and it sort of not just speaks to this particular question, it kind of connects to the previous question as well, and which is actually a matter to worry about, where this younger generation of the Siddis are not very interested to preserve their cultures and traditions, and for obvious reasons. They don't even, many youngsters they're not even ready to acknowledge that we are Siddis. They want that we are Gujaratis. Because they've seen what their parents, their grandparents have undergone by acknowledging their ancestors. They just don't want to look like Africans. Many just straighten their hair so that they look like Indians. So, that sort of trauma that has been, impacted either directly or indirectly is now, unfortunately, putting a lot of these cultural practices into crisis. They don't want to learn Zikrs. They said, what I'm going to draw by learning Zikrs? It is not going to fetch me a job. If I go to a workplace, if I sit in an interview board, they will perceive me still as an African. They will still racially harass me. I mean, Zikr is not going to fill my stomach. Why should I even think about preservations? Why should I think about learning Swahili and Swahili Creole and all of these languages? It is not helping me. Rather, it is putting me into a space of absolute ignorance. But still, efforts are being made. I had this very nice experience when I was in this particular Patthar Kua region in Ahmedabad in Gujarat. It is a huge, Siddi group of people staying there. And, these very elderly people in the communities, when they sing Zikr, they will also make these small children sit in the sanctum and sing the Zikr with them. So at least if through these values, they can at least inherit or at least imbibe these values and remember whatever they might do. I mean, they are not being asked to make Zikr singing your profession. I mean, those days sadly are gone. But then still, at least they should remember. And these songs, the performance of these songs, as I was always saying, it is not just a performance. It is about remembering the ancestors. It is about remembering one's own roots. It is about just remembering where do we belong? Where do we come from? How do we exist here? Just these basic values, if they can remember. Efforts are being made. But for sure, the situation is quite complex.
We can take one more question from Payal maybe before we...
I don't have a question, Sayan, but with whatever we discussed today, and of course, after reading your book, one thing, the major crux of our discussion today and your book has been on the identity, the creolized identity on side of your observations of the Siddhi community in Gujarat, as well as, the Indian Africans that you have, met in South Africa. I was, wondering when I read your book about, Elizabeth also asked a question related to, how the state looks at them and all. But I was just so much, wondering about the fact that we do find a divide within their community itself, with the Indian indentured laborers and the Indian passengers who identify themselves as Hindus and high caste Hindus. It's just so amazing that over there in South Africa, so far away from the, their original roots, they still have that kind of a thing. And I went back to my reading of the African American context if you remember, particularly of the 1980s African American context in America, where particularly when we read books of, say, Toni Morrison or Gloria Naylor and all that, we find that divide not only in the fictional space, but in the actual space in America of the African Americans. Till the 1980s, I think our entire focus was entirely on race, right? Okay, maybe gender. But in the 1980s in America, we find how, surprisingly, the entire African American community was divided along class lines. If we remember the 1980s, we remember Michael Jackson and so many other performers per se. When we also find a book of Alice Walker, The Color Purple, it owns so many Pulitzer Prize nominations and all that, wherein there was this one class of people who had become almost so different from the rest of their counterparts. So while I was reading, Sayan's book, that struck me as almost a similar situation when, there is a divide, there is that, that group of people who feel that they're very different from the other half, their counterparts. So did you really come across that kind of a divide while you were writing that book, Sayan? What were your observations?
Can I add a tangent to that, which actually connects directly to your central concept of creolization? So you interestingly, there's I think two ways in which you've presented this notion of creolization. One as creation, right? So you're getting over, you constantly say that it's overcoming crisis and moving on to this creating of unique objects, practices, identities, and so on and so forth. But the other angle that you take is, especially when you look at the indentured laborers and the slave communities and so on, whose ancestors were slave communities, that of seeing creolization as resistance, right? But I thought, just to connect to what Payal was saying, that in your chapter 4, that also becomes complex. Because when it comes to music, for instance, you mentioned that among South African Indians, there's some divide between the North Indian South Africans and the South Indian South Africans who cannot relate to the chutney music because it largely derives from Hindi and Urdu and the Bollywood styles and so on.
And then you don't feel that it is South Africa,
right.
We are transported as though we are in our country, India.
Right. And similar distinctions exist between the Siddis in Gujarat as well. So I was thinking, on the one hand, to see them as homogeneous, or would it be the other extreme to take them to like a homogenized perspective of resistance also? Because resistance also is so multi-layered that we stop, political theorists stop thinking of resistance as a creative activity. They think resistance is a very clear-cut activity. You know what your political ideology is, you go there, you make a speech, but resistance is as much layered and problematic sometimes and creative as much as any other thing like a food that you're creating. So therefore, I wanted to add a layer also to how you were earlier when you were talking about creolization. I think we have to deepen the concept. It cannot be any mixing. Creolization has to be seen as a conscious adoption of some other culture and emerging as probably a, let's say, new being or in some ways. So there's a very conscious activity of choice and rejection that is happening there, which is indeed what adds the layers and depths to it. So to take on from Payal's to mine, what all...
No, sure. I think, to start with, Payal's question and then sort of connecting both. Actually, there is this very interesting perspective of who are the genuine Siddis and who are not the genuine Siddis. Now, from where did this narrative emerge? So, you will see there is if you ever venture into this literature, you will see this one group of work that talks about the Siddis. So again, to just give you a background, if you read about the Siddis who mostly came in Gujarat, initially obviously they were brought as slaves, but then eventually some of them became army chief generals. Some of them became, harem keepers. Some of them became looking after the state. So they were given different roles because of their honesty and prowess, and obviously because of their physical superiority, that typical way of stereotyping African bodies for generations and ages. And eventually many of these Siddis became kings. They had founded their own kingdoms. Like if you go to a place like Sachin in Gujarat, they had this history of Siddi kings there. And today they are like super flourishing. Now in one of the books I read, it was so sad to hear how their family members in one of the conversations were telling, we are the genuine Siddis. We are the real Siddis. You see, these are the photos of our ancestors displayed in our drawing room and all of these places. There are many Siddis, and there are Siddis who claim themselves as Siddis in Gujarat are actually not the real Siddis. Okay, so this narrative is very much there, how this whole construction, this elitist construction is there, which is highly questionable, highly problematic, that who are the real Siddis and who are not the real Siddis. So it's very much there within that community. Though the best part is it is strongly resisted, because the narrative from where, the place from where this narrative enunciates of the real Siddis, they're obviously very few in numbers as compared to, according to them, who are not the real Siddis. So obviously, and they have their rich histories, traditions, performances, all in very deeply in place and widely recognized not only in India in terms of cultural performances, but across the world as well. But that exists. Now, also that widely also connects to this question of creolization. That is, how do you use creolization resistance? You rightly pointed out, any kind of mix is not a creolized mix. Then the question is, how do we identify creolization? Are there fixed set of parameters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H? No, there are not. But then there are many possible ways of doing it. One of the ways of doing it is to see how we look at the intersections of our cultural practices on a daily life. Like for instance, I always give this very common example. Probably you will know that there is a very common Bengali dish, it's called shukto. If you ever go to Bengal, one of the many things that the Bengalis claim as its authentic Bengali, apart from Rasgulla thing which is widely known across the world, is shukto. But deep down, shukto has nothing to do with authentic Bengali. It was introduced by the Portuguese. It was introduced by the Portuguese. How and why? Because first of all, there was a very short duration of Portuguese colonization in Bengal, and when the Portuguese came, in Portuguese culture it is still there. They love the bitter taste in their salads. And when the Portuguese came, they told the Indian khansamas, the cooks, that you prepare something out of this bitterness and all. Obviously, they said in Portuguese. The Indian khansamas understood something else. They went in, they prepared something. What came out of the kitchen was shukto. That is how shukto became famous. Use of milk in food has nothing to do with Indian traditional food. In fact, on the contrary, if you look at this very ancient texts like Naishada Charita Sutra and all, where they talk about pure food, healthy food, they strictly say don't use milk with vegetables. Don't use milk with meat. So, now when you look at this narrative, when you relook at this whole narrative of Shukto, the perception change. Where is the authentic Bengaliness here? It's creolization. And this is just one small example of many other examples where we can look at this, one of the many ways through how we identify creolization. So I think I'll stop here. Maybe, we can open the floor for reflections, questions.
We have about 15 minutes more, and we are open to take a couple of interesting questions, observations. Need not be questions. It could be your own personal observations or anything for that matter. Yeah, please, sir.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. So what is your solution for the Siddis, for their welfare? There are many instances of this sort all over the world. I will take one example, where people are fighting in a similar fashion. It's the example of the Kurds were spread across 5 countries, oppressed in every country. They're not asking for a separate state. They're saying that we want village autonomy. They say that the minute we ask for a state, the state will ultimately oppress. So if the Siddis want to flourish, actually, they should probably ask for a separate state if at all they can, given their demographic issues, whatever. But if they ask for a state, then finally the state probably will, sort of gain the upper hand. If they don't ask for a state, like what is happening with the Kurds, they will slowly be marginalized in every country, Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and so on. So what is the solution you have to offer for the Siddis?
Okay, this is a very interesting question, and thank you for this question. But the first and the foremost thing, with all due respect and humbleness, I would like to, acknowledge that I shouldn't sit here and offer a solution. You know why? Because the number one thing is, who am I to offer a solution? How much do I know the Siddis? Just working for a project or working for a few years doesn't make me an expert or part of it. But for sure, I do have some responsibilities. If they have taught me something, if they have taught me so many cultural values and perspectives, have enabled me to look at my own cultures and traditions from such intermingling and intersecting lenses, then I also have a very important responsibility. How do I acknowledge that value? And one of the many ways of acknowledging that value, even before, going into this whole narrative of, asking for a state or asking for a separate place and all of these complexities, the first and the foremost thing for me would be to first invite the people and let them know that a community of sort exists in a country. To first of all start at a very basic level. How do we put or include the Siddis, or the Siddis cultures, Siddis values, Siddis histories in the history books, and let the people know about their cultures and traditions and lifestyles and perspectives in various possible ways, which is not there still. Again, we just know about the Siddis. If people visit a lot of these cultural fairs and fests, they would know about the Siddis performing, dancing, singing. If people do keep a lot of interest in cultural narratives, they might have seen a few videos on the YouTube and other sort of social media spaces. But beyond that, what do we know about them? And most importantly, why we should know about them is the important question that we need to justify through those works. So for me, that would be a humble possible beginning. Then probably from there, I presume, if you're able to do that at all, which in many of my works, many of my presentations here also that I'm doing, thanks for this question that gives me an opportunity to do this, to tell people that let us see what, but this is not just about the cities. Like for instance, in Hyderabad, I'll talk about another very famous reputed diaspora community, the Hadramaut community, the Hadramauts, they sort of Yemeni diaspora in Hyderabad. Why do we have so much of Yemeni food places in Hyderabad? It has to do something. It's not so randomly there. There is a strong Yemeni diaspora. But then again, it's just about their food, about al-fahams, about just a few dances. That's it. But that is not just about their culture. If you have to understand their culture, we have to try to, look at it through more critical, through more complex and multi-layered lenses. And what is one of the many possible ways of doing it is to start reading about them in these mainstream spaces. So probably my one way of starting the process would be that, if that is at all possible. I don't know if that answers your question. Sure, absolutely, yeah.
Hi, very good evening. My name is Isha, and thank you for the wonderful, wonderful session. And I think I got to know a lot of things which I definitely wasn't aware of. And most importantly, the Shukta background that you gave us. I am a Bengali, and in a month's time, I'll be going back to Calcutta, and my mom's going to be very sad about it. So getting back to the question, I'm sure it's a very cliched question, but just wanted to know this entire inclination that you've had towards community culture. So is it something that needs to be present in somebody inherently? In your case, has it also kind of molded your personality in some ways? Or was it incident-induced? Or how did it actually, how did that transition in you happen? And you've written a book, and one who writes a book obviously must have been a voracious reader. And you believe in what you say because you've spoken about the whole thing very, very passionately. So how did this whole thing come over you? Was it a transition that happened gradually, or how did this...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's not a very cliche question. It's a very important question for me because, I mean, apart from what I mentioned about my introduction in general to a lot of intermingled cultures and traditions from my childhood days, precisely because of my ancestry. I remember, when my grandparents crossed, Bangladesh border and came to this side, it was already West Bengal because they crossed in the 70s, back in the 70s. They settled in a place called Malda district in West Bengal, and which is again very close to the Bangladesh border. And when they settled in the Malda district, you'll be interested to know that there was this between 1479 to 1493, there was this very brief period of an African kingdom in Malda. And which again, many people are not very aware about it. And it was a very brief period. Sorry, 1487 to 1493. So that was this brief period, where now what happened is, as a child, I remember that during my holidays and all, because my uncles and aunts used to stay there. So during my vacation, I would go there. And as a child, they would take me to these places to visit and all. And I would be very fascinated by this very simple question: what is an African doing in a place in Bengal? I mean, as simple as that. Why Africans would be here all of a sudden? Obviously, at that stage of life, that was the only question. I couldn't think beyond anything about that. But when I grew up, when I started reflecting back, I think these questions, these perspectives with time has woven within me that enthusiasm of understanding cultures always in a very intersectional manner. So for instance, from my very childhood days, even prior to this introduction to all of these critical dimensions of existence, I have always been very fascinated by this intermixing. Intermixing everything. For instance, I have no problem in saying that, I often buy clothes from the women's section. No, I'm not a gay. I'm not a queer. I'm a heteronormative person. But I love going there to buy clothes from the women's section. I have no problem with that. In a lot of places, in a lot of these, spectacle shops, I literally have to fight with the people to tell, if I fall in love with a particular design of a specs where the shopkeeper will try to convince me that it is a women's section. I said, I have no problem. I have to fight with them to choose that one particular specs design which they think is female. I don't think that. I love that. I stand in front of the mirror. I fall in love with myself. I choose that. For me, it is an intersectional way of existence. And that intersection has always been a part of my upbringing. Whether from my parents, from my society, from my perspective, my parents, my family members never ever has taught me to judge. Has never said that this is a male color, this is the female color. I love to wear accessories. I love to wear, beautiful bangles. I love to wear, a lot of neck pieces. I have a whole round of neck pieces in my home. I love to wear that. What is wrong in that? I love to look myself in that way. For that, I don't have to fit into certain kind of identity. I'm intersectional, I'm fluid. I don't believe in stereotypes. So, not fitting in has always been a process of my upbringing. And I think that could be one of the many factors that has always triggered me, provoked me, motivated me to engage, to understand each other in intersectionalities. So that could be maybe understood as one of the foundational ways of ultimately, venturing into this very broad spaces of creolization of music and, whatever spiritual practices, architecture, food and all.
I think we have time for one more question, last one.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation. I wanted to know how diasporas handle this dilemma of assimilating into the host societies and preserving the culture of their home country. Does this cause any friction within them, or how do they handle this process, sir?
Tensions can also become a resistance. Tension can become a methodology of keeping on resisting. What exactly you're talking about is this tension. Where do I belong? small a fundamental question for any diaspora community, right? And these tensions actually that eventually also often lead to the development of creolized cultures and practices. I mean, one of the many factors, again, creolization is shaped through various other factors as well, but tension, that is, where do I belong, how do I belong, what do I do for my belongingness? On the one side, I want to preserve my ancestral traditions. On the other side, for various other reasons, it can be out of love and care and warmth, I want to adopt local traditions, but then I shouldn't fall in love with the local traditions so much that I forget my ancestral traditions. I shouldn't dislike or cancel out the local traditions so that I remain just confined within my ancestral traditions. You know, these consistent tensions that goes often gives birth to creolization. And a lot of these performances, resistances that you see is a form of therapy for them, is a form of outlet for them, is a manifestation of their agony, of their crisis, of their tensions of belongingness, which eventually leads to a way of generating solidarities. So it's a very complexly layered phenomenon when we talk about just this word tension. I mean, it is worrisome, it is critical, it may lead to crisis, but simultaneously it may also lead to, create spaces of liberation, of freedom, of togetherness. At least, it's a simple example. A lot of times, I'm just giving a very simple example to further justify this argument. A lot of times, we feel tensed about something. We feel, why this is happening to me only? But then when you walk out of your space and you try to see around, you will see every other people has some kind of tension or the other. So when 10 people with 10 different tensions sit down, tensions are there, but sort of a collective solidarity is also created through that tension. That sort of dimension can be seen within these Siddi communities as well. So obviously the crisis, the complexity, the question of belongingness has always been there, will always be there. And probably that would further, obviously I'm not trying to glorify that, just to be on the clear page, I'm not trying to glorify that tension, but that probably would also trigger more and more solidifying resistances within and outside the communities. Yes, please. Thank you.
So I have one observation and one question. And the one observation is, I found it very fascinating how you link the musical and spiritual cultures with the ocean and with landscape and with this transoceanic geography. So I think I'm looking forward to reading the book because you brought that out so wonderfully in your talk. And I'm curious to know about how you went about it, because you spoke about how you documented so much of this, so much of their musical heritage, their culinary habits, and their cultures, their sartorial habits. So I'd like to know, was this an ethnographic piece of work? Did you go to the archives because you have spent so much time in South Africa? And I know your previous work that you did on the New Zealand community in Calcutta. So I'm curious to know about how you went about this. Thank you.
No, yeah. Thank you so much, Deepa, for this question, and it's such a wonderful to see you after such a long time. Coming to your question, it was actually a mix of a lot of things. I mean, obviously, the ethnographic work was there, being with the community as much as possible, learning about their perspectives and lifestyles and the ways of their existence and the crisis and the dimensions. And most importantly, I wanted to make sure that as much as I experienced that, I would be able to internalize what they're trying to convey to me, because always we don't speak in these verbal languages. It is also often a lot of in silence and observations and just bodily and ideological performances that we are able to locate the different dimensions and perspectives. So for instance, when I went to Gujarat, for instance, I was not staying in few of these fancy hotels and all. I would stay in, like, they would invite me and I would stay in one of their homes, and you see the sort of challenges that they undergo, but also within those challenges, the kind of love, togetherness, and the warmth and the hospitality, that they generate in that particular process. And that is also a learning experience. I mean, if I stay in a 5-star hotel and then from there I'm talking about big things about ethnography, that really makes no sense. I mean, obviously, but that doesn't mean that I stayed with them for 5 days means, oh, well, I have done a great job. No, that doesn't mean, at least I'm happy in a way that I could stay as closely as possible. I'm happy in a way that I could understand them, learn with them in the most humblest possible ways, as closely as possible, staying with them. So, that experience was also there. But simultaneously for me, and the same thing happened with the South African Indian communities. Like if you go to Durban, right? Durban has like one of the world's largest South African Indian settlement there. You see a different level of dynamics, existential dynamics there. Like Durban is always, affected by floods almost every year. When you see that the mainstream spaces of Durban are immediately amended after the post-flood damage, they still remain in that crisis forever. Like they have to raise funds within their community, they have to beg for funds from the government, and then they end up getting some sort of funds for their, improving their living conditions and all of those perspectives. So that only happened because I went with them within their space. They took me within their space, and I tried to stay with them to at least get a least feel about what they're trying to share and what they're trying to tell. And obviously then simultaneously going to the archives, that what has been written about them. And then you see that whole sort of dynamics where you can't connect in a lot of occasions, where you see some of the narratives are so glorified, so romanticized. Some of the narratives are so demonic, so redundant in nature, as if they are not human beings. And then you see the dynamics and you see these problematic and challenging ways, which I've tried to sort of bring forth in my work, in my arguments, that why it is important to look at these communities, these people, their perspectives from so many dynamics and dimensions. Because if we can't do that, again, as I said, as I confessed right at the beginning, that it doesn't mean that I have done everything and anything. It is not possible. But I think through this process, somewhere, somewhat, I try to be close to the realities, and somewhere, somewhat, I have been able to do that. But again, that's not sufficient, that's not complete, that's not enough.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Pal. Thank you, Elizabeth, for this wonderful conversation. I think we will need some time and maybe a playback, which you will get on our archive, on YouTube. It will be up in a few days. Yes, thank you so much for this lovely conversation. They will be available outside if you want to continue talking to them. And yeah, good night, everyone.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you.
We had a lovely audience. Thank you all so much for patiently listening to us.
Thank you.